BMNR has been a highly volatile company, and as investors, I think it's even more important that we learn to separate the signal from the noise. Therefore, in this video, we hope to talk about the missing piece of the jigsaw. Because previously, we have spoken about how BMNR can help to accelerate the adoption of Ethereum across Wall Street and how that actually benefits BMNR as well as their shareholders. But I think what is more important over here is to talk about what can they do to actually sustain this pace of adoption and how that could have potential effects on their valuation. But as always, potential is a dangerous word, so let's dive in. Now, in the previous video, which I'll be linking up above, we have discussed how BMNR can actually help to accelerate the adoption of Ethereum on Wall Street. And I guess what is really important is that we need to know how this relationship actually helps to drive up the value of the underlying price of Ethereum. But before we really dive into the mechanics, I think we need to take a step back because Ethereum isn't just any other blockchain, right? Since 2016, it has outperformed nearly every major asset, including Bitcoin and Nvidia. This was a slide that was shown by Tom Lee. And this outperformance of Ethereum compared to all these other assets have various contributing factors. But today, I want to specifically talk about one of these contributing factors that is crucial to understanding BMNR as well as the sustainability of BMNR's model. Now, in order for us to do that, we need to peel back another layer how Ethereum works, right? We have spoken about how the staking works and how BMNR can actually protect them and all the different nodes that are being run on the Ethereum network. So, you see, developers actually build applications on top of Ethereum, just like how a developer would build apps that you can download from your Apple Play Store or Apple Store, sorry, or Play Store. But instead of running on a single company server, all these applications run on thousands of individual computers called nodes that together they make up the Ethereum network. So anyone can really run a program on Ethereum, or in crypto terms, run a smart contract, which means that they're asking the ETH network to, perhaps do some computational work, right? Perform a certain transaction. Now, computational work that the Ethereum network does has a cost, and the network basically measures this cost using a unit called gas, right? It's not real gas that we're talking about. And I think this is very similar to how we understand needing to use electricity to power a computer. Now, if you use a computer to power a simple transaction, of course, it is less power intensive, and because of that, as a result, it costs less. However, if your computer is performing a more complex transaction, obviously, this means that you end up using more power, or in Ethereum's case, you end up using more gas, and hence your gas fees are higher. Now, at this point, we need to dive a little bit into the history of Ethereum. And to understand that before 2021, the Ethereum gas fee structure was a little bit chaotic, right? And so because of that, it hindered or it hampered how fast Ethereum could scale. You see, users would have to bid for a block space, like an auction, right? Remember, the block space is basically a page that records down all the transactions. And so if you wanted to transact on the Ethereum network, you would have to bid for a block space, right? So you offer a price for the gas fees. And so what that means is that the users actually have to guess, right? It's literally throwing the dart blindfolded. You have to guess a gas price and hope that the miners accept the transaction. So because of that, it's like an auction. During the busy period, like during the NFT craze, the Ethereum fees or the gas fees on Ethereum would actually shoot up significantly, which causes a lot of instability in the network, which is why there was an upgrade to the system known as the Ethereum Improvement Proposal, or the EIP 1559, and this was implemented back in 2021. And so this upgrade completely changed the way that the gas fees work on Ethereum. Now, previously, users would have to bid as if it is in an auction, and they would have to guess what was the price of the gas fee and try to bid significantly above that so that their transaction would be included. And during that point in time, the entire fee would go to the miners who process the transaction. However, with this new system, the gas fee is now basically split into two components: a base fee as well as a priority tip. Now, the base fee, right, is automatically set by Ethereum's algorithm depending on how busy the network is. Of course, this base fee will rise during periods of high demand, and they will fall when the network, of course, is quieter and there is less demand. Now, there's a certain algorithm to this, there's a certain number behind this, but it's not necessary for us to dive so deep into the numbers. You just need to understand how this works. So this base fee that people pay in order to transact on Ethereum, this base fee will then be burned by the network, which means that it is permanently destroyed, right? This actually helps make ETH more scarce over time because you are reducing the outstanding float of ETH. You can think about this as a company buying back their shares. Now, unlike the old auction system, as long as you pay this base fee, your transaction can be processed, right? Because each block of transaction now only takes around 12 seconds. During the congested periods, perhaps you might wait 2 or 3 blocks before yours actually goes through. So this is where the second part of the fee comes in, the priority tip. Now, the priority tip, as the name suggests, is an optional tip that gives you priority. So this basically encourages the validators to process your transaction a little bit faster. Now, like I said earlier on, during a more busy, congested period, 1 block takes around 12 seconds to process. You may have to wait 2, 3, perhaps even 4 blocks for your transaction to be processed. If you want it to be a bit faster, you can add a tip on top of the base fee, completely optional. And so why this whole system of a priority tip actually works is that because essentially you are only paying to save a few seconds, most people, most logical, rational people will not overpay by a significant amount over the base fee just to get priority and have a transaction that is faster by a few seconds. And because of this, this essentially keeps the gas fees rather stable for Ethereum. You see, in the old system, if you underpaid, if you guessed the gas fees wrongly and you basically bid too low a gas fee, your transaction simply would not go through. So what would happen is that people routinely overbid, and because of that, this makes the whole Ethereum system very unscalable. But now with the base fee that is set automatically by the Ethereum network, you have certainty that as long as you pay the base fee, right, your transaction will definitely be included. You might just have to wait a while. And what this priority tip does really is just to help to speed things up by a couple of seconds. And so because you can only speed it up by a number of seconds, it doesn't really make sense for people to overpay by a large amount. And so what happens is that as a result, this makes Ethereum's entire fee system a lot more stable and predictable and protects users from a sudden spike in price. Now, why am I telling you this? Because what we are seeing both in the US and globally is a structural shift, right? Large institutions are finally starting to feel safe to build on the blockchain. Now, in the US, the Genius Act gives pretty clear regulatory guidelines for things like issuing stablecoins. And recently, back in July of 2025, the SEC also announced Project Crypto, right? It's basically a framework that modernizes the securities regulation and help to enable Wall Street to be able to move a lot of their infrastructure onto the blockchain. So yeah, like already seeing this play out. BlackRock has already tokenized one of their money market funds. Franklin Templeton as well as JP Morgan are running tokenized treasuries. And even Robinhood, right? I have started tokenizing hundreds of listed companies. And beyond tokenization, we are also seeing payments as well as stablecoin transfers being increasingly settled through Ethereum as well as its layer 2 like Base or Arbitrum. And so, as we have discussed earlier, when the network activity increases, Ethereum's algorithm automatically recognizes this and raises the base fee required to process this transaction. And if you remember what happened to the base fee actually gets burnt away and permanently destroyed. So this means the higher of the higher rate of activity on the Ethereum network, the higher the burn rate, which means more Ethereum is permanently destroyed. And one of the best ways to actually measure the real economic activity on the Ethereum network is through tracking this thing known as the total value lock or the TVL. This basically measures how much capital or how much value in ETH, stablecoins, and other tokens is basically locked inside smart contracts on Ethereum. And in simple terms, like I said, it's just gauging how much money is being used on Ethereum's network. So right now, if you take a look at the graph over here, Ethereum really dominates this metric. They account for over 60% of all the total value locked across all blockchains, and this adds up to around $85 billion. Most of it are in stablecoins and DeFi protocols, right? So this is not just capital that we are seeing flowing into the Ethereum network. We are also seeing talent and developers get onto the Ethereum network, as shown by this chart over here. Between January and September of 2025, over 16,000 new developers joined the Ethereum ecosystem, more than any other chain by a wide margin. And so, if you bear this in mind, during his presentation, Tom Lee actually told us that The US banking system has a total addressable market of $3.8 trillion. Now, this is not counting all of the other use cases of Ethereum, just talking about moving some parts of the banking sector onto Ethereum. He tells us that we have a total addressable market of $3.8 trillion. And with only $85 billion in total value locked, Ethereum has a long way to go. And so, in essence, this combination of having a higher total value locked, having more developers come into the Ethereum ecosystem and to build on this Ethereum network, having more real world assets being tokenized, this actually only means one thing: higher activity on Ethereum. And as that activity scales, it actually drives higher gas usage, which means higher base fees and a larger amount of Ethereum being permanently burned, making the float actually lesser over time. And by doing so, you actually drive up the price of ETH over time. Now, I do have a problem. If all the Ethereum network does is to burn the ETH tokens, eventually we'll run out, right? And that is why it is important to understand how new Ethereum is being produced, because this is exactly what keeps the entire Ethereum ecosystem sustainable. You see, Ethereum is designed to pay people that help to secure the network. And so these people are called validators. And this is where BMNR comes in. BMNR acts as one of the validators in the ETH ecosystem. And so, what these validators do is that they lock up their ETH in order to help process transactions and verify everything that is happening on the blockchain. Now, I've explained this in a little bit more detail in my previous video. So, if you're unsure of what I'm talking about, please, I'm going to leave the link down below and up above here for you. So, in order to reward these validators for maintaining the security of the network, the Ethereum network basically issues a small amount of new ETH with every single block that they verify. So, think about it as a modest and automatic paycheck for keeping the entire ETH network safe. Now, every 12 seconds, a new block is added to Ethereum, and when that actually happens, a validator earns a little bit of newly created ETH, and this process of creating ETH and issuing it to the validator is called issuance. Now, just like the base fee that we have spoken about earlier, this whole process of issuance is actually also controlled by an algorithm in the Ethereum network. Now, this is not based on the total ETH supply, but based on the total ETH that is currently being staked. So conceptually, how this works is that the Ethereum network will pay just enough to keep the validators incentivized to secure it. Now, then the question begs, what does it mean by just enough? And I guess it works a lot like bond yields in the bond market, right? When the demand for bond goes up, the yields actually come down. And likewise, when the demand for bond falls, the yield rises. And the same idea applies here. If there are a lot of people staking, the network doesn't need to pay as much as issuance because it is already secure, because there's a large number of validators. So because of that, the algorithm automatically reduces the issuance per validator as the total amount of staked Ethereum rises. Now, on the other hand, if fewer people are staking, obviously the issuance will slightly increase to attract more validators back into the network. And this self-balancing design is why Ethereum remains both secure and efficient. And so when you look at it from that perspective, perhaps in that recent interview that Tom Lee did with Cathie Wood might be right over here when she suggests that this is going to become a winner-take-most system. Because when you think about it, if BMNR really does end up controlling around 10% of the entire circulating supply of ETH, that would make it around 12 million ETH in their holdings, right? If they stake all of those 12 million ETH, that would make them a massive validator. And this concentration of BMNR as a validator could push the issuance rates lower, right? Because as I was saying, this is not decided by anybody. This is actually already, coded into the algorithm of the Ethereum network as the amount of staked ETH increases, the issuance rate will drop. And so this makes it less rewarding for any new players to want to compete, right? It doesn't make it harder, but it makes it less rewarding. So I guess as long as the existing validators, including BMNR, continues to keep the network safe and secure, there is no real reason for an external party to want to come in and disrupt the entire ecosystem for less reward. But at the same time, this whole system of lowering the issuance rate as the number of staked ETH increases also prevents a company like BMNR from becoming too big, because in essence, as they stake more ETH, they would come to a certain point where they would be lowering their own staking returns. And so today, what we have is Ethereum constantly balancing between two opposing forces: issuance, which creates new ETH to pay the validators, as well as the burn rate, which permanently removes a portion of ETH whenever the network is being used. So, of course, as a result, when the activity on the network is low, the ETH that is being generated outweighs the burn rate, and because of that, right, the amount of new ETH slightly increases supply. However, when activity is high, like during the NFT cycle or the stablecoin transfers, the burn rate tends to increase and sometimes even outpaces issuance. And when that happens, you're destroying more ETH than you create. Ethereum actually becomes deflationary. And that is what makes Ethereum so unique. It is a self-adjusting economy, right? It pays yield to the people that are securing it, yet it becomes scarcer the more that is being used. And that is how it has gained value over the past decade. So now that we understand how Ethereum's burn and issuance mechanism work, we can finally connect the dots and see how this affects BMNR. So let's close the loop with all of this. Now, BMNR has been consistently raising capital, and very importantly, they are doing it above their NAV, right? Which means that every new dollar raise increases the value for existing shareholders, and they are using this capital to acquire more ETH. Again, like I said, if you're confused about this, if you're finding us for the first time, I have done a video on this previously, and I will link it up above for you. And so, as BMNR actually buys more Ethereum, two things happen. First, it reduces the circulating supply of ETH on the open market. Secondly, by holding and staking this ETH, BMNR becomes one of the largest validators on the Ethereum network. And their role as a validator is simple, but at the same time, it is important because it is crucial in securing the Ethereum network and to make other people like Wall Street feel safe using the network, right? So BMNR basically helps to keep the network or do their part, right? They can't keep the whole network online, but they do their part to keep their validator node online 24/7. And like I said, when they do so, it gives Wall Street the confidence to continue building on Ethereum safely and to continue to accelerate the adoption of Ethereum. And because BMNR is this publicly traded company that is backed by Wall Street veterans like Tom Lee, many traditional institutions, right, we are seeing are coming onto the blockchain because they feel like they can trust BMNR as a transparent, a compliant, and a reliant infrastructure layer partner. And so what you're actually seeing is, the institutional adoption reflected in the total value locked on Ethereum, which, like I said, we have discussed this earlier, keeps growing as more companies and developers move on chain. So as institutional activity increases, network usage increases, and that pushes up the base fee for Ethereum, right? Which means more Ethereum gets burnt with every transaction, the more the activity increases on Ethereum. And so this will naturally lower the supply of Ethereum. And at the same time, the growing adoption of Ethereum increases the demand. So the burning reduces the supply, the adoption of Ethereum increases the demand. This basically creates a virtuous cycle where the Ethereum price will rise as the network grows. And so this benefits BMNR directly because the ETH that they hold appreciates in value, and as validators, they earn a staking yield from the issuance. Now, so in a sense, if you ask me, I think the entire Ethereum network encourages disciplined growth, right? Because of the issuance rate being adjusted with the amount of stake ETH, it discourages BMNR from becoming too big a validator. But at the same time, this also ends up creating BMNR's moat. Because as BMNR becomes a more dominant validator within the Ethereum network, the lower issuance make it less rewarding or less appealing for new entrants to compete. So as long as BMNR continues doing its job, keeping the network safe and secure, and as Tom Lee calls it, a benevolent entity on the Ethereum network, it is a self-reinforcing mode. And so putting all these things together, here is the loop that we're really talking about. Now, as BMNR raises capital above its net asset value, uses this capital to buy more ETH, it actually reduces the outstanding supply of ETH. Now, with the ETH that they hold onto their balance sheet, they can actually stake these ETH to earn more staking yields. At the same time, use this capital to go out and purchase more ETH. But at the same time, while they are staking ETH, they also act as a validator on the Ethereum network, which increases trust and adoption of Wall Street. Now, as Wall Street continues to be more comfortable with Ethereum, as we're seeing more developers build on Ethereum, it means more activity on the Ethereum network. Higher activity, which also equates to a higher burn rate, which again lowers the supply. So what we have right now, BMNR buying lowers the supply, BMNR staking, giving them a staking yield to buy more and lower the supply further. At the same time, the staking validates the network, right? And then that drives up trust and adoption, which causes more Ethereum to be burned. All of these three things causes the supply of Ethereum to be lowered. And because of that, as Ethereum becomes scarcer as an asset, it drives up the price of Ethereum. And so, with the higher price of Ethereum as well as the staking yield, this actually allows BMNR to go out and sell their shares once again above their net asset value. And this time round, the net asset value will be higher because it follows the underlying price of Ethereum. And they can do so once again, use this capital to acquire ETH and acquire ETH at an even faster pace. And because of that, this creates its own flywheel, right? This becomes a virtuous cycle between BMNR, Ethereum, as well as Wall Street itself. And that is the beauty of it. You see, BMNR is not just betting on the Ethereum token, but they are betting on Wall Street being tokenized on the blockchain and moving the entire financial system onto the blockchain. Now, maybe not the entirety of the financial system is going to be moved onto the blockchain, but if you take a look at what other companies are doing with it outside the US banking system, right? It shows you that the use cases for Ethereum is more than what we can comprehend right now. Just the banking system alone gives you a market cap of, not market cap, sorry, a total addressable market of $3.8 trillion. If you're branching out into the different e-commerce platforms, you're going to have a total addressable market much larger than that. And that is why BMNR's role in this entire ecosystem is extremely valuable. However, you really have to remember that issuing shares is not the only weapon in BMNR's arsenal to keep this flywheel going, and they do have other alternatives to continue to build their moat and to keep up their pace of acquiring Ethereum, and all of this will be covered in the next video, and I'll see you in the next one.